Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are connecting from today, Monday. Happy Monday to everybody. Please let us know in the chat where you are connecting from. It would be awesome to know where everybody is and just to acknowledge that you are here and, understand also and learn that this is a global conversation. Um, Happy Monday to everybody. Today in the US, for a lot of people, it's a holiday. It's President's Day. So I'm hoping that if you're watching this, thank you so much for being here. If you're not, well, doesn't matter what I say, but I hope people are having fun today and resting. That's what matters. But anyway, thank you so much, everybody, for being part of our Hacking HR LinkedIn Live chats. This we have scheduled a number of amazing conversations for the next 6 months, and I am super excited about all the content that we are bringing to you. We have already this is our fourth Hacking HR LinkedIn Live conversation, and we have already talked about mental health, wellness, well-being. We have talked about the value of time. We have talked about turning bystanders into moral rebels, people who speak up in the face of others doing the wrong thing instead of staying silent. So great conversations that you can go back. They are all posted on our LinkedIn Live or in our LinkedIn page. Today we're going to be talking about the behavioral code. And I am super excited about this conversation. And I'm hoping that all of you, especially those of you who work in HR, are also excited about this conversation for a number of reasons. But one of them, and perhaps the most important one, is that generally it falls within the responsibility of HR people to design corporate policy and very often also to enforce corporate policy. And that for a lot of people, that's not so much an exciting part of the work that we do, but it's part of the work that we have to do in HR. And one question that pops up in my mind all the time is: Are these corporate policies even working? Are they driving better behaviors? Are they preventing people from doing the wrong things at work? And the answers, well, we're going to be talking about that today in the chat. So I am super excited to bring to the stage Benjamin. Hello, Benjamin. How are you? Good to see you. How's it going?
It's going very well. Thanks for having me today, Enrique.
Well, thank you so much. I am excited about our conversation. As you wrote the book, The Behavioral Code, and you probably came across a million times with this idea of corporate policy and HR being in the middle of all that, sort of like design of corporate policy and enforcement of corporate policy. So super excited about the conversation that we are going to have today. But before, going there, I want to ask you to please let us know more about you. I would love our audience to know more about your career, your work. Why did you write this book, and whatever else you want to tell us?
Okay, well, thank you so much. So I'm a professor at the law school in Amsterdam. I also teach at the University of California, Irvine. And I got to be interested in the book. And by the way, I co-wrote it with Adam Fine, who's a psychologist and also criminologist at Arizona State University. And for me, at least, and Adam has his own story to tell, but for me, the book came out of years of doing research on why companies come and break rules. And it started all out with trying to understand industrial pollution in China, where I spent about 10 years studying that. And increasingly, as a trained lawyer, I saw the rules that we design, they don't really work that way in practice. And everything I'd learned in law, I saw it didn't really work that well. So increasingly, I started to see that the people who design rules, the people who make rules, the people who are often also involved in enforcing them, they really create a system that is supposed to shape human behavior. But especially the lawyers in that system are not trained about human behavior. So that's why we wrote the behavioral code, which was really about sort of the misunderstandings about human conduct when we try and steer it through law. Yeah. So that's the core reason.
Well, I am excited about understanding much more of this because at the end of the day, that's what we do. That's one of the things that we do in the workplace as HR professionals, right? We design these corporate policies and we try to enforce them. And I want people to understand more whether they are working, and if they don't work, how to make them work. Let me begin by asking you this: why do people break rules? I mean, if there's something that says don't do this and people do it, what's going on in there? Why do people break the rules, especially in their organizations?
So I think there's two core reasons for breaking rules. One is that people may be in a situation where either they cannot follow rules or it's easy to break them. So
Mm,
that's one thing. So the situation. So they cannot follow it maybe because they don't know the rules. If you look at the amount of rules we nowadays have,
yeah,
it's impossible to know all the rules. So sure, we will say, well, it's not an excuse to break it, but if you don't know the rules, how can you follow them?
yeah,
So that's one of the aspects. The other is if it's very easy to break rules. If, for instance, it's easy to hide company money, if you make decisions on your own, if there's no oversight on what you're doing in the company, then there's a big opportunity.
yeah,
So that's the situational part. Then there's also the motivational part. That if you have a situation where there's an opportunity to break rules, you may be motivated to do so. And the problem there is that most of our current thinking is about extrinsic motivation. It's about incentives. It's
mm,
about punishment or rewards. And the research we've looked at, it doesn't really show very clearly that these extrinsic motivations, these incentives have that much influence. They do, but not consistently so. And a lot of it then comes from our own morals and also the social context that we're in. We follow behavior of others, and we also have our own way in which we're dealing with things. And the book covers all these different aspects in
yeah.
depth.
Do you think, Benjamin, do you think it's possible that I don't know if you came across this, but that we may be breaking some rules because we think there are so many rules, right? I mean, let me put it this way: there are rules that we think are appropriate, right? Rules
Yep,
that sanction people that engage
yep,
in, say, discrimination or sexual harassment. But there
yep,
are also rules that tell people how they have to dress to come to work. So when
yep,
you put those two
yep,
rules, do people think that why am I even
yep.
going to follow these rules when they are trying to make me behave in one way that they don't even need to do
Yeah,
that? See, does that make
yeah,
sense?
sure. Look, it's going to be easier to get people to follow rules if A, they agree with the rules.
Mm,
B, if most other people agree with them and most people follow them. Then you don't need anything else. Then you probably don't even need the rules.
yeah,
It becomes harder when in rules we're trying to change existing morals and existing practices.
mm,
And once you do that, as an organization, you have to think, okay, can we actually make that work? So it's very easy to say, oh, yeah, no, we're really going to change how everybody dresses on Friday.
yeah.
But if you really want to get that done, it's going to be very, very difficult. And you're going to get a lot of resistance and you're going to get a lot of rule breaking. And once you get rule breaking on rule A, you may get more rule breaking on rule B. So you may undermine your own authority. So the first thing you actually want to see when you're trying to change behavior in an organization through rules is, okay, what's the current values and current behavior now? And
Mm,
how far from that am I trying to get people to go?
yeah,
So, for instance, smoking is an interesting one. Most organizations in many countries have, because of national law, have banned smoking in the workplace. And it's been quite interesting. Compliance has been very high with hardly any enforcement. Reason is a lot of people didn't want to smoke. A lot of people were bothered by others people's smoke. It's very visible, the smoke.
yeah.
It's irritating. So there was social control over this. If you compare that, for instance, to alcohol abuse or drug abuse, we have not been successful as societies at all to change that, even though punishment is much higher. So
Yeah.
you see, it really depends on the context exactly in which it is put down.
That is so interesting. I actually never thought about it like the way you're saying it, and it is true. We I dislike smoke, and we frown upon when we see even people like smoking within the
Yeah,
25 yards or 25 feet. I'm sorry,
yep,
of our
yep,
sort of like offices.
yep,
But we probably wouldn't think in the
yep,
same way if we see somebody drinking, right? So
yeah.
what's going on in
And
our
it's
minds when we
interesting.
see? Yeah, go ahead.
And the interesting thing is, this is a massive social change. So
Mm,
if you just go back to the 1970s, even the 1980s, I mean, if then workplaces were like madmen. Everybody was smoking.
yeah,
So we've gone and I've seen this in the Netherlands where we've had this at the workplace in the early 2000s. I mean, my librarian in my law school was always smoking, and just the new rules introduced, and bam, suddenly we're all like, how could you even smoke?
yeah,
So that's the success story.
yeah.
Most stories are not that successful. And
Mm,
for me, we can learn a lot from these success stories of the sort of conditions under which this is possible. It wasn't a trick of enforcement. It
yeah.
wasn't a trick of communication or training. It had nothing to do with any of the programs that we are all running. So
Well,
I hope we
that's
can learn from that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Let me ask you this. You talked about the smoking, the banning of smoking as a success story.
Yep.
Why don't we see that in all the other stories where we try to enforce rules? What's preventing having that kind of success?
So there's a lot of different reasons. So, for instance, uh, to name a very difficult one, let's say, for instance, a bribery.
Mm,
Um, if a company has rules that forbid its employees to bribe government officials, and
yeah,
many companies do, I mean, most do, you're not going to see somebody bribing.
yeah,
They're going to do it out there. Um, that's one of the hardest things. You don't even know whether your training that you have against corruption and bribery is working because you don't have any data.
yeah,
Um, it is already a very it, it's a sort of a behavior that comes with I think a context in which maybe if you don't bribe you can't get anything done. It's
mm,
something that's very much embedded maybe in certain cultural norms that
yeah,
you can't change as a company, I mean worldwide. So it's all those things that make it harder. Other example, also a very negative one, harassment in the workplace.
yeah,
Again, not visible when it's serious. There's also power hierarchy there. So with smoking, everybody was smoking.
yeah,
But here you have power hierarchies. As soon as you have a power hierarchy, and I'm pretty sure everybody in HR is very familiar with this. I mean, people in law are not always familiar with it. Everything becomes more difficult,
yeah,
and it's those type of cases that I'm much more interested in. So I think some of the easy behavioral change that we've had for pro-social behavior, being a little bit more ethical. Yes, we know quite something on how to do that. I think the more complex things like willful bribery, like harassment, um, like like undermining behavior at work, like
yeah.
anything that really is damaging and willful, I find much harder.
Yeah, absolutely. Benjamin, you mentioned a couple of times the lawyers designing policy, but being detached from the reality of whatever they are trying
Yep,
to shape. And that is
yep,
making me think about creating successful rules and norms and policies, whatever, as needing for you as a designer to be there to truly understand the reality of what you're trying to shape. How do you think that works in the workplace? Like, how can we design rules, uh, and understand reality? How can we do those two things
yeah,
perhaps at the same
yeah.
time?
So I think in HR, you're in a much better position than most people that are in a compliance department or even
Yeah,
more outside regulators. So in HR, you are at the heart of the organization. So I think one thing that I really see, and the book talks a lot about, is the influence of organizational culture.
yeah,
So there's a quote in the book from a study that says, "Culture eats systems for breakfast." So if you take a standard training system, a standard rule system, you throw it into your organization, if the culture is wrong, it's
yeah,
just going to eat it up.
yeah,
So I think one thing that HR especially can do is to be attuned to risks in the culture.
yeah,
You don't change a culture easily once it's really wrong. Be attuned to it. Second, once you know that and you understand, for instance, informal hierarchies, not just formal hierarchies, once you understand workload, once you understand what for an average employee, sort of what rules mean, once you understand what common behavior is and isn't, then you also understand when these rules from the outside, they often come from the outside, how you can translate them into your organization so that they actually fit the sort of risk that you may have.
yeah,
And there's very so I think you're actually in a better position than most of the lawyers that design these things originally.
yeah,
The problem you have is you're often bound, you don't have enough freedom to create these things as you see fit, I imagine,
yeah.
as the rules dictate what they should be like. And that's why our book is not directed at HR, it's directed at lawyers. I mean, not for lawyers only to read, but it criticizes sort of
Well,
how people
HR has
like
a lot of
I,
lawyers, by the way.
great, but it criticizes the sort of training that we've had. So
Yeah.
if I look at how I've been trained, I've sort of been trained as a lawyer to sort of program humans.
Mm,
If I just write it this way and this way and this way, then they'll do this. And what
yeah.
we see through study and study and study, it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it doesn't. And we see it in the workplace. I mean, we try to do something from HR and we think it's going to work. And not just from HR, by the way. This is not coming necessarily
Yep.
from the HR mindset. It's coming from the organization telling HR, you do this, and then we go and
Yep.
do it, and it doesn't work,
Exactly.
right? And
Exactly.
I'm thinking about,
Exactly.
I think all of us have had the experience of working in organizations where, we go through hours and hours every year of ethics training, and we
Yep.
know that there's something
Yep.
going wrong in the organization, somebody
Yep.
violating
Yep.
those
Exactly.
codes, and they're still there.
Exactly.
So how
Yep.
do you explain the reality
Yep.
versus written rule?
Yep. So let's go to that example. So we've now introduced massive hours of training in ethics and in
Yeah.
all kinds of things. Let me give you an example. I'm going to give you two examples. One example is from a university, the University of California. At some point, they had a fire in one of their laboratories at UCLA. Someone was killed. They then did a study into this, and they found that the person that was in the lab didn't have enough knowledge of dangerous substances.
Mm.
So then lawyers developed a settlement, and the settlement said that future people who went into the lab should be properly knowledgeable of dangerous substances. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Then they operationalized that into HR procedure. What happened? They said, okay, there's 200 kinds of dangerous substances. And for each, they had a 20-page protocol.
Oh.
And then everybody had to sign 200 of these 20-page protocols that went into a data room. So that's 4,000 pages per person. So you have to ask yourself, who would design a system like that? Well, these
Yeah.
people are not crazy. They design a system like that for liability reasons.
Yeah.
The company can say, people were told, so
Yeah.
we're not liable for the next accident. So here's my sort of hack. What you have to ask yourself is, okay, from a behavioral point of view, what will this do? What can we expect it to do?
Yeah.
Probably people don't learn much from this, and probably it will backfire. They'll be like, well, it's so complex. So if you want to do a behavioral approach to this, you would ask an opposite question. You first ask, what is our budget in time that we can get people information? Which you have to be realistic. You have to do all the other trainings.
Yeah.
Let's get a budget, half an hour. Okay. Second, we're going to ask ourselves, what is the most risky sort of thing that they don't know that I could tell them in half an hour that they will remember? And that's what you focus on. For all the other things, either you make it harder to deal with dangerous substances and you take the decision out, or you create other physical safety, or you have to accept that you cannot change it. But the problem with my sort of approach is the liability problem is always there. So an organization will never go prevention fully. They will also do liability management.
Yeah.
I think that's where you're in HR and in the middle. You have
Yeah.
to sort of balance that.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you're explaining this, Benjamin, you're making me think also about sanctions, right? What happens when you tell those people working with those dangerous substances, you tell them if you do something wrong with the substance, you're fired. Does that work? Like that's the kind of sanction
Yep.
or like idea that you're gonna be sanctioned if you do something wrong. Does that work?
Here's the interesting thing about punishment and sanctions. So we've
Punishment.
looked at this. So once you punish, many different things start to happen.
Yeah.
There's many sort of effects. One is you may deter people. They may be scared because they hear there may be a punishment. Great. Once you punish, you may also get people to hide behavior more.
Mm.
So it goes underground. It may also people that they don't discuss it anymore. It goes underground. It may be once you punish that the people who actually want to do comply, that they feel, well, I don't have to comply anymore unless actually there is punishment.
Yeah.
I will only wait until there is a credible threat, which often there isn't, because most people won't know whether you're doing something. So there's about 18 different things that you can activate with punishment. So it depends, A, how you punish. B, it's a very sort of backwards thing. You can only punish after it's happened.
Yeah.
So I'm all for prevention. I think having no punishment for the most serious offenses is really bad idea. You don't want impunity, but leaning only on the punishment side won't work. You mean as HR, you're not a big police organization, and even
Yeah.
if you were, you probably couldn't control it.
Yeah. How do you design for prevention though? I mean, that means that number one, you have to know that something like that could happen.
Yep.
Because it either happened before or because you know for whatever reason you know that X
Yep.
kind of behavior can actually happen.
Yep.
But how do you design for prevention? I mean,
Yes.
especially when we live in a culture of if you do something wrong, we gotta punish you, rather than
Exactly.
let's not wait for you to do something wrong.
Yeah. So first of all, you want to take that threat a little bit away because people need to have trust to talk about problems.
Mm.
So I think that's one of the first things. People
Culture, like you said before.
Yes, but there's several elements. First, don't set unrealistic targets.
Mm.
So if there's a lot of pressure on a lab like this, mistakes are going to be more likely.
Yeah.
So, and I know this is a much harder thing than just compliance. If you want to reduce the workload on people, it's probably going to cost the company more.
Yeah.
Second, you need to make sure, and you talked about this already in an earlier program, that people have voice.
Yeah.
And voice, one of the most important things that I see is empowerment, and that means organization,
Yeah.
which again is a very sensitive thing in certain jurisdictions. But the people at the bottom need to be able to be able to speak out when they see mistakes. If you have a organization where there's work that deals with high risk substances, if people can't talk about near misses, if they can't talk about things that did go wrong or almost went wrong, they also cannot learn how to prevent. So I think those are sort of the organizational things. There's also sort of the heart intervention where for some things, for some people, maybe they should just not be able to do it.
Yeah.
Sometimes you want to maybe have two people on it. So for instance, on high risk of bribe paying sort of assignments, maybe put two different people on the job, very, very different types of people. Having one person, the chance of acting badly is higher than if you have two or three or four persons.
Yeah.
So there may be other ways of doing this. There's different ways into this. And I think training, it's only part of this, but because we all know training, because it's relatively cheap, because we don't know its effects very well, that's sort of our default. And yeah, I don't think it works for all these different types of things very well.
Yeah, absolutely. What happens when we know that we have designed bad rules or rules that don't apply anymore? And I ask you this because, the nature of work has changed dramatically over the past 3 years since the
Yep.
pandemic.
Yep.
And in addition to that, I think is in the workplace, it's kind of like a traditional thing that instead of removing a layer of policy that
Yep.
doesn't work anymore, you add
Yep.
something on top of it, right? So you add
Yep. Yep.
punishment,
Yep.
rewards,
Yep.
prevention, blah, blah, blah,
Yep.
instead of like
Yep.
going to the roots of the thing. So what happens
Yep.
when we know that
Yep.
there's a rule that doesn't work anymore? What do we do? How do we think about it?
I call these zombie rules.
Makes sense.
So most rules are zombie rules. I mean, if you would now go into your own organization, if I go into my own organization, if I dig deeper, I'll probably find 90% of the rules nobody knows, nobody.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody acts at all, maybe even 95%. So you could say that's not a problem. And these rules are dormant until something goes wrong and somebody
Yeah.
digs them up and there's a liability and there's a case. So they're sort of dormant for the lawyers, I mean, people like me and some people in HR to find and activate. But from a behavioral point of view, they're dormant. Ideally, I would prefer that we have systems with far fewer rules that are far better understood, far better designed, far better attuned to the social context that they're functioning in. So I'd rather have organizations indeed combing through their rules and getting rid of them. The problem is once you start that conversation, you're waking up a sleeping dog.
Yeah.
People are going to be like, but these rules, we need them.
Yeah.
I've tried it in my own organization. I was head of research in my faculty, in charge of compliance also with ethics rules. And every time I pushed back against a new rule, I would say, look, a rule, and if you add something, you have to delete something.
Yeah.
I could never do that, even though I was in charge of that field.
That is incredible.
And the problem is it all creates more workload.
Yeah.
Or overload in information, and both are not good. So I think you're undermining the stature of all the rules if so much of these rules are just dormant.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do we think? I think that we create a lot of rules when we witness one case of something, right? I mean, somebody smoked within 100 yards of the door, so now we have to create a new rule saying it has to be over 100 yards. How do we avoid getting dragged down or carried away by the idea that if one person does it, everybody else will do it then, and we have to create a rule for that? How do we avoid, if it's avoidable or if it makes sense to avoid it?
Yep, it's a really good question. I have two answers. So the broad answer that the book talks about is we need an ex ante approach rather than ex post approach.
Yeah.
We're very ex post. We're very much if something bad happens, then we respond either by enforcing rules we have or asking for new rules. Yeah. So we have what some sociologists call a risk rule paradox. Yeah. So we go through a risk, then we have a rule, and the rule's supposed to solve it. The other one I think is more how we work, and this is not in my book. In work, we often go after what we call in Dutch the rabbits, which pop up everywhere, instead of the elephant. Mm-hmm. And the elephant's just standing right behind us. And there's all these rabbits. And we're like, yeah, we need to deal with the elephant, but first the rabbits. So this also has to do with how do you organize at work? How do you make time for the elephant?
Yeah.
How do you make time? How do you make sure that, look, we'll let the rabbits come up for a while and breed and do the things rabbits do, but now we're going to focus on the elephant.
Yeah.
And that means that you need to do this sort of big cleaning, this big, why are we here? What are the big risks, rather than just responding to every problem. It also takes a leadership with a long-term view.
Yeah.
And the problem is, and you'll probably see that in HR as well, if you have a leader that's really knee-jerk reactions to events, your department is going to be knee-jerk reactions to events.
Yeah.
But you need a leader that says, look, we're now going to go after the elephants. And I think HR can probably talk back to leaders and say, look, we know we've been doing this last year and all these small things, we have all these small rules, but this is the elephant. If you don't deal
Yeah.
with this, we're going to get this elephant-sized problem.
Yeah, you reminded me of I had a boss, and I worked in this place where they were creating all these rules about everything. And my boss in HR said to me, "Man, like the leaders in this company are trying to save cents, and they are losing dollars, right? And they are losing the big
Yep,
money because they're focusing on the small things, and the
yep,
elephants are like right in there, the value, the opportunities, and they are
yep,
missing them for focusing on the
yep,
meaningless stuff."
yep. On the other hand, what I said earlier, so for me, the elephants, for instance, in organizations are often unrealistic expectations of employees and lack of voice.
Yeah, yeah,
But these are very big elephants because tackling them is way more expensive and difficult.
yeah,
But I do think at least having a conversation, for instance, if you're an organization that has unrealistic targets, if you talk about it, you can say, okay, what do we do to mitigate the risk of these targets? For instance, the more risky the targets, I would say the more voice you need,
yeah.
because you need to be able to talk about what happens.
Yeah,
If you want to have less voice, fine, then you also lower the targets. If you want to have higher targets, let's make sure people can talk back against them
yeah,
and back against how they're implemented. So I think it's these type of things we need to be doing.
yeah. Let me ask you this. There's a little bit of a paradox here, and it is you want people to have a voice. You want people to talk about things that go wrong or almost went wrong. But at the
Yep,
same time, you have the rules that tell you we fire you if this
yep,
happens, which
yep,
could also be we fire you if this almost happens. So how do you
yep,
manage that paradox in there of
yep.
asking people to have a voice versus
Th-
the rule?
That's a crucial paradox, and so that's also why I'm really hesitant on focusing too much on the liability here. So I
Mm,
was once at a forum at NYU where they talked about companies collaborating with the Department of Justice, and if they did, then the company would get a lenient treatment by the Department of Justice. And everybody in the room was like, yeah, that's great. That's going to be a great incentive. And I raised my hand and said, what will this show to the employees lower in the company?
mm,
Because they're going to be hung out to dry. And they're not going to talk upwards if something goes wrong. So are you going to really prevent things? So I do think, yes, there is a balance here. And I think I'd rather have a lower liability so we can make sure that we know what's happening,
mm.
instead of just trying to go after things. I don't think that would work very well.
That is
Yeah,
quite a mindset change, though, because we're telling
yeah,
people, lower your liability, educate, learn from the
yep,
people, learn together with
yep,
them. But we're so used to the sanction
yep.
approach or the rule approach. How do we
I
change
know,
that? How
I
do we
know.
change mindsets then?
So I think it is about having a conversation about the long term. It is
Mm,
also about a conversation about the worst cases.
yeah,
It's a conversation about, okay, do we really want to be the worst companies? And that's what I'm doing now. I'm doing a large project where we're studying the most negative organizational cultures in organizations where we see structural long-term misconduct that is really
wow,
serious. And we do that in order for others to learn from what has gone wrong there in terms of risks, to have those conversations. I can say one other thing about this. So also we do have jurisdictions like, for instance, in Canada, where they give workers right to speak out.
mm,
And that seems great, right? You have the right to speak out. But even if you give employees the right to speak out, something can go wrong. So for instance, if you work in a factory, and I have a colleague who studied this, he worked in a factory for his PhD, he did 1,000 days of field work, and he found there were continual near misses and really dangerous things. He lost his head nearly twice.
wow,
But he found that people couldn't speak out, even if they wanted to, even if they wanted to, even though they had the right, because of the sort of informal hierarchy, the
mm,
way they were pressured every day. So if you have the right to speak out, but you cannot,
yeah,
what happens when something goes wrong? what happens is you get blamed as well,
Yeah.
because you had the right to speak out, you knew it, and you didn't. So I think it's a really difficult thing. So I think it only works also if there's some form of empowerment where you make sure people have the capacity to also really speak out.
Yeah, you're making me think about the story of the tragedy of the Challenger.
Yep,
I'm sure you
exactly,
read about
exactly.
all these
Yep,
engineers knowing there's
yep,
something running here.
yep,
I'm
yep,
barely speaking up to
yep,
say there's something running here, and we know that happened,
yep,
right? And
yep, yep.
so there's a culture element in there.
100%. So what happened with the Challenger is, in part, they had unrealistic targets for a long time.
Yeah,
They gradually moved away from safety to just meeting these targets.
yeah,
And they gradually normalized what everybody should know is not normal behavior. So
yeah,
yes, that's a great example. And that's one of those types of cases that we're looking at. But the sorts of things that we're looking at are to really understand what are the different patterns, because there's not
yeah,
one pattern.
yeah.
And I think that's, in the end, if we really want to improve a behavior in companies, is where we have to look at.
Let me ask you this, Benjamin. I will go next to the question of how do we encourage people to do the right thing then without rules or with another approach to rules. But before getting
Yep,
there, I want to ask you about this. Going back to that plant worker, right? There are managers in plants, especially like in that kind of like more manual kind of work, where they
yep,
also have targets
yep,
to enforce rules. They like
yep,
how like are
yep,
your people coming to work? Are they coming to work on time?
yep,
So
yep,
their success depends on enforcing rules that sometimes don't even make sense. So how do you
yep,
manage kind of like that
yep, yep,
idea of encouraging these leaders to
yeah.
enforce something that may not work?
This is a very interesting thing. So first of all, the rules you just mentioned, they do make sense. They make sense from a output perspective.
Correct.
So they assume if people keep coming to work and you can observe what they're doing in work, they're going to be more, there's going to be a higher output. Even that's not fully true. So I have a colleague at Harvard who did a study in one of those mass factories in China. And in that factory, they had a very high level of transparency. So there was cameras everywhere and everybody could see your work
Wow.
the whole time. So they were making phones, and he had his students work in these factory lines as to do participant observation. And he found that the workers had found workarounds that they thought were more efficient, but they had to hide them from the cameras. So he saw through the field work they probably could be more efficient if there was no cameras. Then he asked the managers, "Can you give me a number of lines in the production, and can I switch the cameras off and put curtains around them?"
Mm.
And he did, and he showed through that experiment that they were 5 to 10% more efficient and
Wow.
higher output than the others. But what's interesting is what the company learned from this. Instead of taking away the cameras, they said, so you can do experiments. So they then started to experiment with higher targets.
Oh,
So
gosh.
that shows, A, somebody gives you a win-win, a clear win-win, because it's easy to do. But instead of taking the lesson, you go for more oversight and higher targets.
I think I know the answer to this question that I want to ask you, but I want to ask it either way.
Okay.
What do you then think about this new technology and software that even tracks the amount of time that people are on the computers? They typing
Yep.
of the keyboard. What do you think about that? I mean, I think it's stupid, by the way, and there are reasons for me to think about that beyond just the science of enforcing rules and whatnot. But what is your thinking about this?
So this also leads to sort of the question you alluded to earlier. What would work for better behavior?
Yeah,
I think this is a clear one, that if my boss follows what I'm typing on my keyboard the whole day, I'm probably not going to be very comfortable. I probably won't have a very positive view of my boss. Also, it undermines the sort of trust relationship that you need to have between employer and employee. And that's one of the things that rules and incentives that we've all set up undermine. The more rules we put in the workplace, the more people start to talk from rules and not from trust.
yeah,
And the less we trust, the more we need rules. And I've seen that so clearly in my work in the Netherlands, that we have a lower trust, more rules, which creates lower trust, more rules, which then means we need to put a lot of time on the rules.
yeah,
And if we cannot trust people, I mean, people are, even in this sort of production work I talked about earlier, they know better how to do their job than you do from the
yeah.
top. They will learn better how to do their job. And otherwise, you hired the wrong people. So then it's a hiring problem. So I think no, it's not a good idea.
Mm.
Maybe for some really really high risk type of things, but they
Yeah.
don't come to mind right now.
Well, it's fascinating because I'm thinking that, exactly what ends up happening in the workplace is, we put in place all these rules, the cameras and the technology to track your time on the keyboard and things of the kind. And once again, going back to what my boss of many years ago said, we're focusing on the cents and losing on the dollars.
Yes,
Like you said, we're focusing on the rabbits and losing on the elephants, right? Or because we
yes,
are doing something that we know doesn't work, but I don't know,
yep,
makes people
yep,
feel better. I think the leaders feel better because they think they have this oversight that will force people to
yep,
do what they want them to
yep.
do.
Well, that's the funny thing. I'm really wondering whether it really makes them feel better.
Mm. You
So
think they add more job to them?
I mean, if you choose, you're going to be a leader of company A or company B. Company A is a high oversight company. You have all the data as a leader.
Yeah,
Company B is a company where people love going to work, where there's high trust, where people value the leadership, and where people you find at some point do the extra mile for you.
yeah,
Where would you want to be a leader?
yeah,
So I think if you take that step back and you look back at the choice, which is of course not how this happens,
yeah.
because you are already in company A where there's a lot of oversight, and you add some.
Well,
So yeah,
there's a little bit of
it's a false
theory
sense.
X, theory Y here, right?
Yeah, it's a false sense of comfort, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So what works? Does the carrot work? Does the stick work? Something in between? What do you think?
So first of all, it's not about carrot or stick.
Mm,
So carrot or stick are extrinsic motivations
mm,
that both we don't have conclusive evidence that they work. So carrot, it seems better, but if we look at the evidence for preventing bad behavior, doesn't always work better. And
yeah.
a carrot, when it becomes habitual, is very similar to a stick. I always have this stupid story of my son. So my son would get a reward, a sticker, every time he went to bed nicely. So he did so 10 days in a row. Then came day 11, he didn't go to bed nicely. I didn't give him a sticker, which then became a punishment.
Yeah,
So they're not fully opposite. They're two sides of the same coin. We talk about this in the book. Um, no, I think what really works, um, several things. One is what we talked about earlier, is this high trust organization,
yeah,
making sure people, it's clear what's expected of them, which is important. So there has to be clear, it has to be realistic, but then also they have to be given the space to do what is expected of them, and you have to treat them in a way that's fair. So there's a lot of research also in organizations that people who work somewhere where they have a sense that they're being treated fairly in a procedurally fair way are more likely to then also see that organization as having authority over them and accepting that voluntarily.
yeah,
I mean, for me, that's always the sort of success stories for me are the stories where at some point we don't even need the rules, where we can sort of take it away, where it becomes more automated. I
yeah,
think the second thing is to make sure that if that doesn't work, that you back it up, by making sure that for the worst situations you decrease opportunities for bad conduct, that you make sure that what you do is aligned with what people think morally and socially. And finally, yes, you also back up the worst behavior with sanctions, and you do need to have sanctions and maybe also some rewards for some kinds of behavior. But it's in the mixture. It's not in the
yeah,
singular approach.
yeah.
So
And
a
you
good
said
example,
before.
yeah,
Oh
yeah.
no, go ahead, Benjamin, please.
So another learnable example on behavioral change is seatbelts. So if you
Yeah,
look at seatbelt usage, so in the US, every car had to have a seatbelt from 1973 onwards, mandated by a federal rule. Then we see in the early 1980s, only 20% of people, even though every car had a seatbelt, were wearing the seatbelts. So 80% was not safe. Then individual states adapted these mandates for seatbelts. So you had to wear a seatbelt, which wasn't before, it was just the seatbelt was there. Then compliance, sort of seatbelt wearing, shot up to 50%. So that shows a good thing. If you make a rule, there is already a large amount of people who will follow the rule just because it's a rule. That happens especially if you're in a rule-bound organization or society. New rule, we'll try and follow it. Then they started to have a little bit of punishment, not high fines, $100. It went up a little bit more. Then they had public safety messaging, went up a little bit more. Then they had the warning beeps, went up more. Then people saw others wearing seatbelts, and it normalized, went up even more. And nowadays, we don't even think about, it's not a decision anymore. You click it and it's in. And that's for me always the roadmap. How can you go more towards this roadmap with any rule that you introduce and away from just staying in this sort of punishment zone? And
Now,
that's sort of, and that's where the thinking should be.
now, Benjamin, let me ask you this. I have actually seen videos of people in the late 1970s, early 1980s, completely upset and annoyed at having to at being forced
Yes.
to wearing
Yes.
the seatbelt. How do
Yep.
we do all of this in less than 40 years? Because it's been a long time since we implemented this. So how can we make the observance of good rules something
Yep.
that happens
Yep.
naturally in
Yep.
less than
Yep.
40 years?
Yep. Well, and actually, it went faster. So I would say it probably happened between 1983 and the mid 1990s
Okay.
for the front seat.
All right.
I think it has a lot to do with, of course, this is an easier situation. So first of all, seatbelt, you only click it once.
Yeah.
So you have it once. So speeding, for instance, we've not been able to deal with,
Yeah.
even though the fines are higher. So I think that's an interesting thing. Second, for seatbelts, there was a lot of debate about the rules. So there was voice in the rulemaking process. So there's a study that compares Illinois and Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, on seatbelt rulemaking and compliance. And it found that in Illinois, there was a massive debate, as you said. People were against it. Finally, the rule was adopted through a democratic process. People have been heard. And then the rule was made, people complied. Yugoslavia, nobody complained about the rule. It was adopted, nobody complied. So that's also a very important thing. If you're going to make rules, get the criticism on the rules on board.
Yeah.
Get people to be heard also in that phase. Do we do that? No, we don't, because we make too many rules.
Yeah, you're making me think about. I used to live in Washington D.C. and there's this avenue called New York Avenue. That
Yep.
avenue back then, when I was in D.C., it was the avenue with the most amount of traffic cameras in all the traffic lights. However, in this same avenue was the avenue where the police were collecting the most amount of high-speed tickets. And I was
Yes.
thinking, how is it that we know that all the cameras are here, and yet
Yep.
this is where the
Yep.
police collect the most amount of money? So like people are like not caring that the camera is there.
Exactly. And it's a fascinating thing. I mean, if you look at I mean, speeding is an interesting thing. We now have the technology
Yeah.
to know A, what the speed of the car is, B, to reduce the speed of the car, also to know through GPS what the speed limit is.
Yeah.
So we could limit speeding. We could eradicate it through technology. We can take away the opportunity. And there's another other important lesson here. We can make people much safer by taking away choice, but that comes with a price.
Yeah.
The price is freedom.
Yeah.
So people would not really accept that, and I think that's a good thing. So you need to balance that. You want to give people the choice to do bad things,
Yeah.
but maybe the worst things you want to make it really difficult for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Benjamin, as we get ready to wrap up our incredible chat, which I'm hoping has been of a lot of value. It's been a lot of value for me, and I hope it's been a lot of value for our community tuning in here. I want to ask you one last question. And I don't want to oversimplify the behavioral code, your book. Everybody, please go to Amazon or whatever platform you use to check out the book and purchase it, the behavioral code. But I want to ask you this last question, Benjamin. Couple of insights, maybe tactics that HR people can sort of learn or embrace right now as they continue to move forward in creating or ditching rules, if you will, like something that can help them think through the best approach here.
So I think the most important thing is to stop being a carpenter who sees a nail everywhere because you have a hammer. I think that's the most important thing. So start from what is the problem, what could be the root causes of the problem, and what fits that problem. I think that's the most important. So our book, really shows different approaches you can use, and to stop being that carpenter with the hammer. So that's the short answer I would give.
Oh, I love that, and I love HR, by the way, but I can't deny that the reality for us is that we see a lot of things from an HR perspective, and with the work that I do in Hacking HR, I've been trying to tell HR people, you got to get outside of our cocoon in HR and see what's going on outside, because that's where the magic is happening outside. So Benjamin, thank you so much for spending this time with me and sharing all these insights with me and the community. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank
It's
you,
great.
everybody. Stay tuned for our next events and LinkedIn live chats. Thank you. Bye, Benjamin. Have a wonderful week.
Bye.
Thank you.
You too. Bye-bye.